Welcome to Monday Thoughts for the Week, a production of Global Agri-Trends. Clear, concise, market intelligence. Here are your hosts, Brett Stewart and Simon Quilty.
Good morning, everyone, and welcome to Monday Thoughts for the Week. Brett, I hope you had an enjoyable July 4th holiday last week, and all our American listeners. Brett, a lot going on, and dare I say, in the last day or so, Donald Trump, Brazil, 50% tariff, somewhat is driving the bus at the moment. But Brett, I'll hand it over to you, but it is a full agenda today as we speak, with many things to be covered. And, we'll be looking at price forecasts on fresh 90s, 50s, cows, Angus steers in Australia, you name it, we've got it today, Brett.
Thank you. It really is an interesting time to be doing what we do here. If you're anywhere in this global protein space, there is no shortage of things to be watching, data to be following, politics, economic markets, cattle cycle, fill in the blank. And so, yeah, this is fun. I don't know what we'll do, Simon. Fast forward, 4 years when Trump leaves office. We're going to have to work harder to find stuff to talk about. But as of now, it is an endless flow of information for us to talk about. And we start off today with this. Trump proposes 50% tariffs on Brazil. And so he threw this out middle of last week and said, as of August 1st, 50% tariff on everything Brazil imports. Of course, he was complaining about Brazil's prosecution of former President Jair Bolsonaro, which Trump called a witch hunt, an international disgrace. Bolsonaro was a political ally of Trump. You got to realize here kind of how the chips lie. So Lula da Silva is a very, very left-leaning, polar opposite of Trump. I would guess the two would never get along and don't get along and probably really irritate each other. And so that's important to understand with what's going on here and what can happen in the coming weeks. Trump also cited the trade imbalances and Brazil's alignment with the BRICS policies as reasons for the tariff. Now, he did throw out in the letter and said, if Brazil will commit to manufacture in America, then we can solve this real quick. Now, I don't know what that means. I don't know what Brazil's going to manufacture in America. We'll see. But that's where it stood. Now, if we look at beef, of course, this is all about beef. Here's the Brazilian beef to the U.S. And what I did here, this is U.S. imports from Brazil, lagged 1 month, so they line up closely. Brazilian exports to the U.S. And we saw that data came out last week. Record high U.S. imports from Brazil, shocking amount, 57,000 tons of beef from Brazil in 1 month. But that was the May data for the U.S. Now we've got May and June shipments from Brazil, and you can see what happened in May and June shipments. We're going to see those Brazilian exports fall rapidly just based on the lag in the trade data. We know it's already happened through June. And so a 62% drop in those shipments coming in. Now that May shipment paid the full tariff, the 36.4%, or yeah, 36.4. So the new tariff, if you think about it, the 10% tariff goes away, the 50% tariff comes on. Brazil pays 76.4% tariffs. What we've got here, this is the average weighted price of beef into America, $3.18 a pound in May. The average price of beef coming in from Brazil, $2.54 a pound. There's always a big spread there, and Simon's talked at length about it in past webinars about that discount on imported beef. And it's that's a 60-ish, 70-cent range. That's similar to the discount on Australian, New Zealand beef. So a 76.4% tariff. Brazil would need to be shipping beef or pricing beef in country at $1.43 to pay that tariff and get it in the door at $2.54 where they have been. So that's one way to look at it. That's looking at it from the US side. And I know this is far more complicated than just this simple analysis because you have different cuts. And this is just from the US side looking at what's coming in. Now, Simon's going to flip the switch here and look at it from the Brazil side because the US isn't the only market, right?
You bet, Brett. So yes, we matched here the four-quarter 6 to 9 cut four-quarter product out of Brazil against the imported Brazilian 90s price. And you can see that at various stages, China, which is the dark blue, looks like a far greater option, a better option for the Brazilian exporter, to the point where there's a price spread. It looks of close to $4,278 per metric ton when 76.4% duty comes into play, Brad. I can see that it's just not going to be affordable. Now, people would say, well, at a price that'll flow back into America. But my argument is at that level, it'll flow into the Middle East,
Yeah.
into Asia, into everywhere else but America.
Yeah.
So we're at levels that are really low. And, the big question, as we put in our paper last week, what would happen to Australian beef and New Zealand beef? No doubt they would jump in value because the marketplace has become so reliant on Brazilian beef. And in particular, Brett, the Brazilian importers have been holding large inventories and making it available in a just-in-time process. And that has been one of the turn-offs in the past for importers is holding large volumes of Australian or New Zealand beef.
Yeah.
But now Brazil has offered it on a plate.
Yeah.
So I think it gets very interesting. I can see Australia, New Zealand prices jumping almost not to parity with fresh 90s, but I think within 10 to 15 cents is potential. If this comes through, hell, a lot more, a lot can happen between now and then, Brett.
It's pretty interesting. Oh, this chart, Simon, I look at that chart and go, US isn't the highest bid for Brazil. Not in 2025. They're selling beef higher to China than they are into the US. And so that's important to understand what they can do with China. Now, we've seen that Chinese price go up. You can see it right here. If we look at Brazil's monthly beef exports, they sent 7 times more beef to China than to America in June. So if they're only trying to displace that 18,000 tons, half of that may go to China, throw on another 9,000, and half of it goes on to all others, another 9,000. They've got places they can absorb it. Also interesting there, if you look closely, you can see they're shipping almost the same amount to Mexico now that they're shipping to America. 18,000 tons of Brazilian beef going into Mexico. My guess is that Mexico line is going to continue rising. Mexico is this close to becoming the #2 market for Brazilian beef, and we may see more of that.
Great.
Pretty interesting. So tell us about these spreads, Simon.
So, to our point earlier, Brett, today the price spread is about 61 cents, and you've got Brazil versus Australia and New Zealand. I think it's sitting closer now to about a 12 cent a pound spread. So, the question is Brazil meat dries up dramatically, that spread narrows. We know fresh is not going to fall, therefore, Australian, New Zealand 90s will rise. And Brett, if you go back and look at late 24, that came within about a 20 cents price spread difference. I think Brett will see, as I said, somewhere between 10 to 15. Now, in the autumn months, we've often seen Australia go back to parity with fresh 90s. If it plays out, lots of ifs, do not rule that out either, Brad. So all we know is that lean meat, they are so reliant upon imports, it's not funny.
Yes, absolutely. So it wasn't just Brazil that Trump went after. He paused the tariffs yet again for everybody. So July 9th was the 90-day pause. July 9th comes out and he says, okay, I'm going to pause it again. I'm going to give you to August 1st. And here's where he's at. And he wrote some very specific letters to Japan, Korea, and some other markets that said, look, you're at 25% now. And you can see what these countries are shipping. For Japan, 148 billion a year from Japan coming to the US, 131 billion from Korea. Those are the big two. The question is, if we get something done there, what do we gain? What's kind of interesting, Simon, our beef is tariff-free to Korea. Our pork is tariff-free to Korea. Our pork is almost tariff-free to Japan. Our beef pays 23% to Japan. So the only real nugget out there in Japan and Korea is US beef. And do we see a break in that tariff? Because if he cuts that US beef tariff to Japan, I would guess that Australia's or the CPTPP agreement into Japan says if you cut someone else's, you got to cut ours. So there could be some changes coming with Japan. I would suggest Japan can't survive this economically. I think it would put them, as you've said, into recession. And so there is going to be some pressure. There's going to be some negotiations. We're 3 weeks out. If I had to guess what happens with Japan, Simon, I would say they're going to come up with something. They're going to pitch it to Trump, and on July 31st or August 1st, they're going to come out and Trump's going to say, we have a framework agreement with Japan in place, which means nothing. It has no details, but it's something Japan's going to do to try to kick the can down the road a little further and buy some time. But the heat is on. The pressure's back on from Trump. And here's one of Trump's tweets. Threatening the world, the tariffs will start being paid August 1st. There has been no change to this date, and there will be no change to this date. So he's basically shaking him by the feet saying, pay me the money. I need the money. But then I like how he ends it. Thank you for your attention to this matter. At least he did say thank you in his tweet, Simon. I don't know.
He said the other week.
Yeah, yeah. You'd never know who you're getting, right? You just don't know who you're getting.
Yeah.
This all has impacts, and it affects currencies as well, Simon. Tell us your thoughts on this.
Well, Brett, this was really just a bit of a snapshot. So let's go to the far right there. But when the Brazil tariffs comes out, you can see that they fell overnight, and they went from that rise since the start of this year of 14% down. They fell 1%. But so did all the others. I mean, the yen, the Korean won, the New Zealand dollar, they all came off 1%. So right now, they're all, since the start of this year, they're up 7%. Overall is the yen, the won, and the New Zealand dollar, 6.7. The Aussie's up 5.3. The real up 13%, and the yuan 1.7. Brad, as you know, you want to be as low down on that list as an exporter as possible to be trying to maintain a comparative advantage.
Yeah.
But for what it's worth, I actually was surprised that that real didn't fall further. Anyway.
Yeah, that is a huge move for Brazil.
And Brett, BRICS, I mean, this is the other interesting thing as we look at some of the ramifications. So it's really bringing together, countries that may not have otherwise come together to form an alliance. And so, part of BRICS, Russia, Brazil, India, China. Now we've got Indonesia, Iran, Egypt, Ethiopia, the UAE. 40% of global GDP, Brad, is now part of BRICS. That's starting to get some leverage. And I guess when you look at some of the threats made, but a 50% on copper, 200% on pharmaceuticals. We know that Donald Trump said, if you become part of BRICS, we're going to knock you over the head with even higher tariffs again.
Yeah.
Brett, there's pushback starting to happen, and there are relationships and synergies and starting to evolve that was never potentially there before.
Yeah, the battle lines are being drawn. The world's being carved up. And Trump is using BRICS a little bit as a straw man or a whipping post and saying, choose carefully whose side you're on here. Yeah.
Yeah.
So we boil it all down, Simon. Yeah, where's the winners, losers out of this whole situation with Brazil, tariffs, and beef?
So let's start by saying that a letter to Australia is something we've got to be mindful of, that we may not be out of the woods ourselves. There is this issue of US beef, even though technically they're saying it can access Australia, but we know due to traceability, they're saying it can't. They don't meet the requirements. So, do we in the next week get a letter ourselves? But here are the concerns. Japan and Korea at 25%, Brett, they potentially move into recession.
Yeah.
Therefore, demand on imported beef falls away. Thailand, Malaysia, Indonesia, the Philippines, you can see the tariffs 36, 25%, 32%, 20%, all very important export markets for Australia and New Zealand, and to a certain extent, America's shipping into some of these as well.
Hmm.
So there's the concern. What's the damage to these economies and therefore their ability to buy? The wins, well, 50% tariff on Brazil, lifting 76.4%, and we remain at 10. Brett, we've got a comparative advantage. And
Yeah.
I guess what's clear is that as long as you're not in the firing line and can maintain your lower tariff, you've got a comparative advantage. And we know that volumes will probably fall out of Brazil and they will need to turn to Australia and New Zealand, higher prices we could expect.
Another winner out of this, Simon, is also China. And anywhere else Brazil exports beef, they'll probably see a little bit of price break.
Yeah, agreed.
All right, well, shift gears here. The screwworm drama swings back the other way. Within a week of opening the border on this phased border opening approach, a finding of Mexican screwworm in Veracruz closes the U.S. border again. This is 370 miles. You look at those dots and look where those dots are headed. They're following the cattle prices. I mean, the higher cattle prices are always north, and those cattle are following the prices north, and the screwworm is following the cattle. Um, I don't know. I would say be very careful. I don't think we're going to see any stability in imported feeder cattle from Mexico in the next year. I think this is going to continue. They're going to fight it. Mexico's going to say we have it under control. The reality is it's a fly. It's with cattle. They don't have it under control. I would say this thing's out of control in Mexico today. And it's going to keep creeping north. Colin Woodall, president of National Cattlemen's, came out and said it'll be in America by the end of the year, later this summer. He may not be wrong on that. We may have it right up here on the border within weeks, within months. And I think it's just something we're going to have to adjust to. But we're going to have to learn to live without those 1.4 million Mexican feeder cattle for the interim. That just tightens
Brett,
this U.S. supply another notch.
it's really all about illegal movements of livestock, that they just follow the money. And
Yeah.
as we discussed before today, but when I did a study of Southeast Asia and the movement of lumpy skin disease and foot and mouth, you just had to follow where buffalo prices were peaking, and that's where diseases occurred. Now, it wasn't because of the Indian buffalo, they just showed where the highest prices were, and illegal livestock flowed to where the highest prices were. So, this phenomena is nothing new. This has been occurring all over the world, and I think is a huge part of disease flows around the world today.
I had a webinar this week, Simon, with the disease panel. It was an animal disease conference. And bottom line, I went through all the major animal diseases, and my bottom line was it's all getting worse. It's not getting better. I don't care if it's lumpy skin, ASF, foot and mouth, screwworm, HPAI. Because of the increased flow of people and goods and food around the world, these disease issues are all getting worse. Buckle up.
Agree.
So, Simon, some thoughts on the fallout from these tariffs. What have we seen thus far?
Well, consumer spending, Brad. I mean, this is an interesting one. You can see that it has fallen away quite dramatically. And in May, it unexpectedly fell. And this was a result because we'd seen prior to that the boost in preemptive buying of goods like motor vehicles, people tried to rush ahead of the tariffs, Brett. But as the impact of the tariffs started to occur, people then started to back away. So, in part, this is a sign of the toning down after the, you might say, rush to the door to buy up before the impact of tariffs. So, overall, consuming spending accounts for more than two-thirds of economic activity. It dropped 0.1% last month. Brett, I think that there are some telltale signs. I mean, we are amazed at how strong demand for beef continues, but let's be mindful, there are some tailwinds or headwinds starting to appear.
Mhm. What about Japanese Wagyu exports?
Well, that's an unusual one, but they're down 20% year on year, Brad. Just because now that they've imposed the extra 26.4%, because Japan is tied up in the other country,
Yeah.
plus the next 10%. So they're paying 36.4% just like Brazil is. And Brett, that has truly impacted not just Brazil, as we've seen in the last month or so, but the elite end of the market, Wagyu beef out of Japan, down 20%. So overall, shipments out of Japan have been pretty good. Overall exports, I think that says more about their oversupply problem that will continue this year and into next. But Brett, for what it's worth, tariffs are having an impact in Japan.
Yeah. Interesting. China.
And then last week, we've touched on this the last few weeks, but you can see there exports to the US fell off a cliff in the month of May.
Yeah.
And we don't need to repeat that story, but the tariffs had an enormous impact. In part, they were made up for, into Europe and other parts of the world, as you can see there. But the impact is starting to tell on China. There is no doubt.
Yeah, for sure. Well, Simon, over to beef thoughts. We've got a lot to talk about today. Where do we want to start this story today? Feeder cattle.
You bet. So, Brett, back at record levels, 320. It's extraordinary, isn't it? And I
Incredible.
guess the take-home message here, Brett, is the tightening of the herd continues. We know that. And they ended the week at up 1.35 cents. This is a record for a front month contract, on the futures market. US wholesale box beef prices tumbled after jumping on Tuesday last week. Brett, there's going to be ups and downs, but one thing's for sure, prices are moving higher, and I don't care what anyone says. I think June, July next year, as you know, is where ultimately we're heading in terms of the peak in the market.
Yeah, it is starting to clarify there. I watched some of the results of the Superior video auction. There's a big cattle video auction last week, Simon, and they're pricing cattle off the video for fall delivery, for August delivery for yearlings and for fall delivery for calves. Boy, there were a lot of 8, 9 weight steers brought close to $3 a pound at 8, 900 pounds, $3 a pound. You can do that math. 2,400 to 2,700 per head. The calves, 550 weight calves were 380-ish for those steers. Those little 480 pound calves where I grew up, they were all bringing 450 pound. It was unbelievable. But the crazy thing is those cattle are going on feed and have a chance of making money. And that's when you put 90 bushels of corn through those calves. Fortunately, corn's cheap. It's kind of the perfect storm for the cattle feeder. But the guy that's most nervous about all this, Simon, is the banker. I know there are some nervous bankers that are financing these super expensive cattle, and they're a little bit nervous.
So, Brett, more reliance on imported as a result.
Oh yeah, absolutely. For now, that's where it is. Yep. Big US beef imports in May. I showed that chart on Brazil earlier. Beef imports surged to 551 million pounds in May, the second highest month ever, up 60% from a year ago. This is hard to forecast. I'm trying to forecast these. It's pretty shocking. I had them at 421 million pounds, up 23%. The Brazil was a surprise. That big shipment out of Brazil was a surprise, but I'm not going to be surprised now because I know what those Brazil shipments were in May and June, and that's going to come down pretty quickly. Heavy slaughter rates last year suggested a possible rebuild, but it's not begun yet in Brazil. Brazil's May exports to America were nearly half of their big April levels. Lower shipments coming. The real question is, Simon, has the Brazilian rebuild begun? We're seeing those export volumes start to tail down. I don't think it's begun yet, but I think we got to watch it closely here in the next 6 to 8 months. According to Lygia, other contacts in Brazil, it sounds like it's pretty likely that rebuild is going to be starting here. So the big imports, I get a lot of grief from my cattle ranching family and all ranchers. They love to hate imports, and that's the same in every country. And I'm not defending imports. I don't have a dog in this fight, but I've had to tell them, look, you can curse imports, but you can't curse them when your cull cows are bringing $1.49 a pound. In fact, I ran the data just to prove it. These two, cull cow prices and imported beef volumes, are positively correlated. The highest prices you'll ever get for your cull cows are when beef imports are the highest. Those high beef imports are not killing your cull cow prices. The cull cow price goes up and then it pulls those higher beef imports. And I said there will be a time to complain about imports, but it's not right now because these cull cow prices are absolutely incredible.
Brett, when I was writing the paper last week, Bob Chuddy made the comment that he thought there was more lean meat coming into America than was being produced in America itself. We did the study on that during the week, didn't we? And it's close, but it's not quite that, I think. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, that was kind of what our numbers showed is we're still producing more lean grinding beef in America than we're imported, but it's pretty close. It's
Yeah.
approaching 50-50 now. We're talking 5 billion, what did I say? 5 billion pounds of beef imported. That's a carcass weight equivalent, but 5.2, I think, in the last 12 months. We're a 5 billion pound market. We produce 22 billion pounds of beef a year. And I think that was fed steers and heifers, 22 billion pounds. And we're importing 5 billion now. And that
And
is
that's
the
why Brazil matters.
that's the market forces at work, right? That's a market
Yeah.
saying we need more beef. We're record high and we keep putting in new record highs. That's a market screaming for more beef. I wrote an article this week for one of our bank clients, and my argument was, Simon, I said, imported beef probably takes more market share from US chicken than it does from US beef, ultimately, because we're
Yeah.
talking fast food grinding beef, right?
Agree. Yeah.
So kind of interesting to follow this weekly beef production. We've seen that beef production very stable over the years, and I made the argument these record high prices are based on demand, not supply. Per cap supplies are stable over the last 4 years, but look what's just happened in the last 3 months. We've seen that weekly beef production year over year. We are now gapping lower. It's happening. And it just happened mid-year. We're now starting to see production truly fall below year ago levels. That's the first time in the cycle we've seen it. Again, Simon, that's probably an indicator suggesting that the cycle is starting to turn, the rebuild's beginning. We're actually starting to see this dog hit the end of the chain after 5 years of drought and continued stable production. We're now seeing that production start to drop. And I think this is the beginning of the run up into 2026 where we see those record high prices. So Simon, over to you on this. How is global demand faring on two beef fronts? And we're going to talk about ground beef and high quality beef.
And Brett, this was, 2 weeks I wrote two separate papers, as you know, and driven, I guess the first one was mainly by the fact that we've seen record prices, for global beef right now. The figures came out last week. We're now at 139.4 for the month of June, of which Australia, Brazil, and US beef prices are how they derive these levels. And Brett, I still believe, as we've said before, the high in global beef prices will probably be around about June, July next year, the middle of next year. So we are still on this journey. It is far from over. But if, Brett, we focus on ground beef, and that was, the headline was hamburgers today at record prices. That's with fresh 50s and 90s doing what they're doing. But this is what I found interesting. When we looked at hamburger values here today at 348, Brett, and you can see that progressive increase. And the big concern is, how does this result against the likes of chicken? And what it showed as you went looking at the price spread between the 77 CL beef block, which makes the hamburger, and the chicken breast, you can see that at that $2 point, and we go right back to 2020, where if it touches upon that $2 point, as long as it's for a brief period, it's sustainable, Brett. And in recent times, we've traded really in what looks like to be about a 150 range in pricing between chicken breasts and the burger. So, Brett, the question is chicken, taking market share? Without doubt, in the fast food sector, that is a given. But when it comes to retail, it's pretty clear beef is holding its own, and it will continue if that impact on chicken is all but brief, as we've shown here. But I'd love to hear your thoughts.
Yeah, that's pretty interesting. And I think that's right, Simon. The quick serve restaurants, if I go into Wendy's, their menu is absolutely covered with stories about chicken nuggets. If you go to McDonald's, it's all about their new chicken tenders, chicken breast sandwich. It is the year of the chicken breast when it comes to fast food. These guys don't want to sell hamburgers. They're not making money on them. And that'll continue. I think every time we go through one of these cattle cycles, we give up a portion of the market to chicken. Chicken can replicate. They can make chicken 90 days. There's more chicken. And I think they take a whack out of that market every time we go through one of these big cattle cycles. Chicken takes a new percentage of it.
I would argue that even with that, retail has made up for the lost ground in the fast food service sector. So retail has played an absolute crucial role in ensuring that beef remains robust in terms of its demand.
Yeah.
So here's the big call, Brad. And I think that we are in the middle, or not the middle, but we have started the rebuild. You don't get fresh 90s trading at 409 and not be in a rebuild of some sort, okay? And what happened back in 2015, 14, 15, which is where I've drawn a lot of my analysis from because I think it's so similar, is that it was the tightness of cow availability that drove prices to record levels to begin with. But it was like handing over a baton, and then it transgressed into the tightness of fed cattle and the lack of flats, eyes, insides, knuckles, and those items that are going into the pack that saw that price remain sustained for almost an entire year. And I see the same happening again, where today, Brett, it will be the tightness of cows over the next 2 to 3 months, but it will, as we go into next year, be the tightness of fed cattle that ultimately leads to that, I guess, sustained pricing. I'm calling it around 260, 265. That's a big call given that the fresh 90s, USDA has not quoted it for 10 days, Brett. That is unusual. Tells me
Unusual.
it's very tight out there.
Yeah.
Trades are hard to come by, or people are not wanting to report them. The chances are because they've gone significantly higher. Anyway, Brett, they're my thoughts on Fresh 90s. Give me your feedback there.
Hard to argue, Simon. I think that's an uncanny correlation right there, looking at where that happened last time around and where we're headed. I think it's pretty solid.
I think history, in a way, is kind of repeating itself. So when we talk to 50s, I think next year is a repeat of this year. We're in a tight market now. 50s, due to the carcass weights that have a seasonal aspect. And overall, the market is going to respond next year with heavier carcass weights to try and make up for lack of production. I see this as rinse and repeat. We are going to see next year a very, very similar pattern to this year when it comes to 50s pricing. So, Brad, I've got it at 275. I think we get there within the next few weeks. I think today the market's somewhere around 265 as we speak. So, rinse and repeat. And therefore, Brett, I put the cow price in Australia. I think we're going to see tightening as we move into a rebuild in the south in Australia, a mild rebuild in the north. But I see prices peaking in cows this year at around 365. There are parts of Australia today where 310, 320 are already trading. But it's next year, Brett. At 440, I've got the peak in September 2026 as the impact of those global markets tightening, but also in particular, fresh 90s in America moves higher, brings up imported with it. So, Brett, they're my thoughts when it comes to Australian cow prices. Let's now talk about the high end because both are being impacted, the ground beef and now the high end. Brett, when looking at overall exports out of America of chilled beef, which is the high end of the market, the best way to measure it, we can see that over the last 5 years or so, there's been this gradual decline. And in actual fact, it's down 26% when measuring January to May since 2021. So, Brett, definitely at that quality end of the market, there's less availability of US beef, of which Australia is playing a critical role, and grain-fed in particular, in filling the void there. So down 26% since 2021. On frozen, Brett, it was a bit more front-ended, and you can see that the real fall happened in 22, 23, and with the US frozen exports have slid sideways since then, but overall, over 4 years, a 21% decline. So still the need to backfill in that area anyway as well, Brett. And we know that the impact in trade flows, when we saw those licenses suspended for China out of the US, the end result was we saw, the amount of beef being shipped there has become a trickle today. And Korea pretty well took the brunt or the lion's share of that rediversion, with a little bit into Japan, but I would say Korea, Brett, really took the brunt of it. And domestically, a lot of the chilled stayed at home that would have gone to China. So here's the interesting price spreads, Brett. US, if we look at export values, you can see into China, it's blown out to an extraordinary 48% spread. That's because the volume is so thin and the items going there are probably highly valuable. So, Brett, it's when you get such a small volume, it can blow proportionately things out of whack. I don't think this is truly representative, but it's a consequence of the lack of meat going out of America into China on pricing. And Brett, when we look at the next value into Korea, you can see that in the last, since March, April, a decline, and it's impacted Australian pricing into that market as well as US pricing. So that rediversion, I think, is starting to show up that would have gone to China, out of America, has now gone into Korea, and that pricing has seen that now back at a 25% spread. How long that lasts, I'm not sure. And lastly is Japan. Now, this is interesting, Brett, because it's narrowed a lot. I think what's happening here is that Japan is just looking for a bargain. An Australian flatback grain fed is cheap. And the net effect is that US is losing, I think, market share to much cheaper Australian grain fed as US prices move higher. So, Brett, I kind of see Australia's role in Japan growing and the US getting less as prices move higher and Japan migrate to much cheaper Australian grain-fed flatback type cattle.
Yeah.
So, Brett, backfilling. So when we put those three markets that have been impacted by different flows due to tariffs, but when you look at China, we're down 31, America's down 31%, and Australia's up 38%. So this is from January to May this year versus January to May last year. Taiwan, it's a similar story, up 4%, America's down 7.4. The Philippines, 14.7 versus 1.5 down. Canada up a whopping 40% from Australia, down 3.9 from America. UAE, 16%, America's down, Australia's up 23, and Singapore 21 up versus 36 down for America. Brett, we're backfilling everywhere. That's the message. And when you look at export values from an Australian point of view, this is wonderful news because pretty well everything's higher, about 17%, with the exception to South Korea, because of that rediversion out of America into that market. So that fell, we get it. But overall, if you look at every other market, we're talking about a 17% higher export value year on year. And Brett, when we join the dots with the tightening in America, prices moving higher, US fed cattle prices against US choice prices, there's a strong correlation, 95%. Then when we look at Australian export values against US Angus choice prices, once again, it's a very strong relationship between the two. And as we've discussed before, expectation for fed cattle prices to move higher. So let's join the dots, Brad. And effectively, with that, Australian Angus prices that follows closely our chilled export values, the end result is much higher prices going forward. And Brett, I've stayed true. We're going to be $5.50 by the end of this year, $7.50 by the end of next year on very tight, chilled global beef supplies next year. Share me your thoughts.
Onward and upward, Simon. It's hard to argue against higher prices, and I know a lot of people look at these prices and say, no way. We are at the glass ceiling. There's no way we're going higher. But the reality is we're going to start to cut supplies. And when you cut supplies, prices don't go lower. So it is going to be an interesting year to see.
You bet. So Australian lamb hits record prices again, Brad. And last week, they went to 11.12 on heavy lambs, 11.08 on trade lambs. There were other trades that weren't reported that $12.50 and even $13 on heavy lambs out of Wagga. And I heard trade lambs at $11.50 to $12. So, Brett, this is no surprise, is it? But where I get kind of, I don't know if the word is concerned, but here's the latest MLA survey, producer survey. Last October, they're talking the size of the breeding ewe flock to go up for 2024. And then now in May, what are we? We're talking 6-7 months later. Now the breeding flock is to fall 9%. That quick turnaround to reduce down to 44.3 million, Brad. Now, Brett, I am concerned more about that October call. And let's be honest, the May call should be no surprise. And the real reason is, Brad, that if we look at where lamb slaughterings are today and mutton slaughterings, they're down significantly and are going to continue that trend in downwards. But we're down 15% year on year in terms of where the week's at in lamb. And in mutton, we're down a whopping 35.7%, Brett. And I think that trend continues. And Brett, we've talked about this before, but it's on the back of the liquidation we've had for 2 years. So we've been killing the flock and the breeding flock at an alarming rate above the 2 million break even. And I'm just surprised that those October figures should talk about an increasing flock size in terms of breeding, when in reality, we've been killing the hell out of it. And Brett, record prices should be no surprise to anyone. We've been reading these tea leaves now for 2 years with exactly this outcome. So, Brett, I'm going to get off my high horse here, but it does worry me how that October, I don't think it was correct. So, once again, female lambs had to be in the mix here as well. As we saw in March, a whopping 6.8 million. You don't get to that number of kill without killing your female lambs. And as a result, we know that higher prices have occurred since. So, Brett, I'm going to step down off my soapbox, but for what it's worth, global sheep meat prices are a whisker away from now being at record levels. So 148 came out for the month of June, and 152 was the high in October 2021. Brett, we're going to absolutely smash that record, and I expect the highs probably in June next year as well. So we're up 68% since the lows. Brett, here's my belief that we're going to probably go in terms of the index to a high there, a whopping high of around about 170 when it comes to sheep meat prices. And as I said, the middle of next year. Beef will be delayed, I think a little bit later, 2 months maybe, and I'm expecting the beef to peak at around about a 160 or so. So Brett, higher record prices ahead. So we're going to keep saying that record prices this month, but the peak is probably the middle of next year for sheep, and for cattle a month or two later.
Well, we'll keep beating that drum, Simon. In a way, it feels like these forecasts are really coming into focus. We have better data, it's clarifying, it's getting easier to forecast those. Over to pork thoughts. So let me start with this. So Supreme Court made a decision on Iowa's challenge to Prop 12. And this was kind of the Hail Mary, Simon. This was it was Iowa and some other states jumped on board, filed this appeal and said Prop 12 cannot stand in California. This is the animal welfare case that imposes regulations on all farms in or out of California that supply California. It was approved by California voters in 2018, implemented in 24. It requires 24 square feet of space for breeding sows, and it has caused a 30 to 40% increase in the retail price of pork in California. So it was led by the Iowa Attorney General, Brenna Bird, who led this coalition of 23 state attorneys general and supported the appeal, and the Supreme Court said, nope, we're out. And so is the story over? Well, I say that's the Hail Mary. This is the Hail Mary in American football when you drop back and the clock's run out and you're trying to make that big pass and you can't make it, and you just happen to see somebody over the side and you pitch the ball to them and try to keep the game alive. The story's not over yet. Trump came out this week. His administration filed a lawsuit this week against the state of California and Governor Gavin Newsom, alleging that the state's anti-cruelty laws are contributing to the high cost of eggs and that those state laws are superseded by federal law. They're saying you cannot pass those state laws, our federal laws supersede. So we'll see what happens. That's all tied in with this Prop 12. This is the chicken and egg side, but it's all part of that same law in California as an animal cruelty law. The Justice Department said those requirements weren't driven by consumer purchasing decisions. They were driven by activist conceptions. And so I guess what all this means is the fight over Prop 12 is not over yet. This thing still has a little bit of life to fight against Prop 12. So let's take a scan here of global pork exports. I just ran year-to-date numbers to show how we compare to the past 5 years in pork exports. You can see the US is kind of the lone decline out of the big exporters. Europe's actually up 3% after that huge 3-year decline. Canada's up 4%. Brazil's up 17%. China and Mexico are both down, pretty small suppliers. But you look at that and you go, why the lower pork exports in 2025? Why are we lower? Well, is it to deal with currency? Here's the global pork currencies. The euro has increased, making them less competitive. The yen has increased, making them a better buyer. The Canadian dollar's increased, making them a better buyer. Mexican peso has increased, penalizing Mexico's exports and also encouraging imports from America. The Brazilian real is higher, penalizing them. So all these currencies are punishing our competitors. They're encouraging our import markets. And yet we look there in 2025 and our exports are lower. In fact, if we look at the May data, pork exports were down 3% in May, down 4% for the year. Now, you look at that chart, it's pretty easy to see what happened in May, right? It was China. Those were the high tariffs. But across the board, if we look and say, we only have two growth markets, Colombia and Honduras, they're the only two markets out of our key markets that are actually higher. So what's the excuses? And I say excuses, these are valid excuses, but I wanted to go through why are US pork exports lower this year? One, tariff threats have scrambled the markets. We had Mexican jitters over tariffs. We've had a lot of threats back and forth that Mexico could put on retaliation. We've had the China slow down, those high tariffs. All of this, overseas buyers are trying to diversify. They're worried about the reliability of US pork and potential tariffs. Also, Korea saw a huge Q1 a year ago. They grew 41% in first quarter 2024. We're probably not going to keep that level up there. And so we're pacing a little below in Korea. Brazil and Canada have been much more aggressive and more affordable in Japan. And so you can see there, Japan, we're down 59 million pounds. That's our biggest declining market. And get this, this hasn't been out in the news much, but the only real pork tariff we face around the world in retaliation is Canada. Canada has imposed 25% retaliation tariffs on US pork. They're the only one out there that's really hit US pork. And I'll tell you, Simon, over the last 12 months, the most nervous hog producers on the planet were Canada, worried about US tariffs. And they didn't get the US tariffs, but instead they still put retaliation on US pork. The US has no tariffs against Canadian pork or hogs, but look at Canada, down 29 million pounds. So maybe that's just me kind of making excuses, but that's really why we only have those two growth markets. So
China also has
what's that?
the tariffs. China has tariffs though as well.
Sure, yeah, and that was the first point. That China slowdown, we definitely
Yes.
slowed down. We lost 2 months to China, and when we talk about a 4% export decline year to date, a lot of that was 2 months without China.
Yeah.
So I guess the point here is the bad news mostly behind us? And mostly it is. My forecast, I've got exports down 1% for the year. They're down 4% year to date. So that's what I'm looking at there. Mexico is going to be a push. It should be better than that. And maybe Mexico will surprise us a little bit, but there's still a lot of uncertainty around tariffs with Mexico. But when I look at trying to forecast this market, this is the weekly export data, weekly export shipments. Now, this is Packer reported. It's not actual numbers, and it's a terrible data set. And I write about it every week because it's weekly. The only benefit is it's timely. So we can see it through last week. Now look at what May showed. This is the weekly data, showed that May would be down 22% from a year ago. The actual for May was down 4%. So you can see how bad this weekly data is. I had actually forecast -4%. I went against the trend and said, I'm not buying the weekly data. Now, what about June? June says we're going to be up 12%. We had a huge month for exports in June. What's my forecast? I think we're going to be up 2% in June. And so it's kind of hard playing with that weekly data. It throws a lot of head fakes. So where are we at? If we look at pork exports monthly, there you can see 25 in blue, 2024 in orange. That period right there, the first 5 months of the year, we're down 4%. What are my forecasts going forward? I've actually got forecasts for pork exports for the rest of the year up 1%. So you merge those two together and you get a -1%. That's where we're at. It was actually -3.6. I'm up 1% for the rest of the year, and we end up -1. So still a lot of ground to cover. We're past the middle of the year, but in trade data, we just got May. So we still have 7 months of trade data to go. Now, one thing to watch, Mexico is 40% of our export volumes. Look what just happened to Mexican hog prices. That's a huge rally. $1.42 a hundredweight carcass equivalent hogs in Mexico. We're 111. They're $1.42. Now, back in May, that Mexican hog price equivalent was 109. So one, the peso has appreciated and the hog price has appreciated. So what does this mean for half of the hams in America that go to Mexico? Take a look at our ham price. We just had that big spike and dropped. We're 97 cents on hams. Mexican hogs are $1.42. That tells me we're probably going to get some business done with Mexico here, and probably in the next month. And why this is important, look at our ham price seasonal. We kind of had an early launch. Did we peak too soon? I think we did. Is there another seasonal ham peak ahead? I think so. I think the next month of data, and you said, Simon, the USDA hasn't been reporting data very well. We're going to see that ham price pop back, I think. And I think so just because of where Mexico is right now. Mexico should be better than it is. I think they're going to be buying. If we don't have any big trade hiccups, I think we could see another little rally in the ham prices. Over to disease. New African swine fever was found in Western Germany. This Western case, it was a wild boar. If you look at the map of Germany right there, almost all of those cases have been on the east side of Germany, along that river, that border with Poland. But look at that wild boar. He got there somehow, right? He's clear out there just south of Frankfurt. So if you're in the Netherlands, Belgium, Luxembourg, you're getting nervous right here. This virus is moving. You can see that farm infected 6 months ago, right up almost on the Netherlands border. So you say, where in Germany is that virus today in wild boars? Probably all over. If that boar had it down there, it's probably everywhere. This remains a major concern for European hog producers. And the reality is it's going to continue to spread. They have not been able to contain it. And in their defense, I don't know how anyone could in this wild boar population. So let's wrap it all up, Simon. Key thoughts for the week. So U.S. tariffs round two. Trump has fired the second volley. Downside, 25% tariffs in Japan and Mexico put them into recession. Or to Japan and Korea, sorry. Japan and Korea, 25% tariffs would be crippling, which tells me that won't happen. They will do something. They may cut the U.S. beef tariffs, but they're going to do something. The positives, winners, losers, well, it's going to be interesting to see what happens here. If some countries like Brazil have a 76% tariff and Australia, New Zealand, and others don't. I think your analysis was spot on, Simon.
Just avoid his gaze, as you said in the past.
Keep your head down. Don't look, don't make eye contact, and hope that he ignores you. And that should be the strategy for Australia. No
Yeah.
comments in the press, nothing, just head down, quiet. But he has his crosshairs on everyone. I mean, everyone's on the chopping block here.
And the trade flows out of Brazil will change if that 50% comes in. So, yeah.
For sure.
Falling US beef production creates opportunities, Brett. We've outlined ground beef. As long as, the short-term spreads with chicken are short-term, then beef prices are sustained. We expect high 90s prices to be sustained for the balance of this year. Fresh 50s, rinse and repeat in terms of pricing. Australian higher cow prices expected going ahead. On the high-end cuts, Brett, US chilled and frozen volumes are falling, in particular chilled, which has seen backfilling all over the globe. Strong US demand is keeping high-quality beef at home. Higher global prices are expected.
Off we go.
Record lamb prices should be no surprise, Brett. We have been liquidating this flock, the breeding flock, for 2 years. These prices today are no surprise. And my only concern is that some of the previous surveys of producers should have reflected the high liquidation that we've been seeing for a good while. And you just have to talk to farmers in Victoria, the Riverina, South Australia. This has been going on for a long time.
Yeah. Reasons for U.S. pork export optimism. I think the bad news is behind us. We had 2 months basically without most of China. Mexican hog prices have pushed into higher territory. Even our shipments into Japan are improving. And as I showed you, I've got exports positive for the rest of the year after we started the year -4%. And so I think there are some reasons to be a little more optimistic about U.S. pork exports. So, Simon,
Great.
save the date. August 19th, it's coming up. I've got my plane ticket. We are getting anxious and ready to go. This is going to be a good discussion. I think by the end of August, we're going to have some more data. We'll have some new data on
On the
prices.
day itself.
And we'll see where these tariffs are. By August 19th, we'll know whether that's a go or not. This will be a great time. Good time to discuss markets and connect and chat together. So looking forward to it. If you haven't signed up, jump in and go. You can shoot Sherry a message, shoot us a message, get signed up, and looking forward to the meetings.
Should be good. Thanks, Brett.
All right. Well, Simon, good information. Hope everyone out there has a great week and don't hesitate with any feedback or questions.
Thanks, Brett.
This has been Monday Thoughts for the Week with Brett Stewart and Simon Quilty. This podcast is a service for subscribers of Global Agri-Trends. Clear, concise, market intelligence. For more information, visit our website at www.agritrends.com.